Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're going to tackle something that's probably on a lot of your minds, and it definitely keeps me up at night.
Oh, what's that?
It's this feeling of information overload. There's so much research out there, so many studies published every day, that it can feel impossible to keep up, let alone make sense of it all. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we all want to make decisions based on evidence. We want to know what the research actually says, but how do we sift through the mountains of data, especially when it seems like studies are constantly contradicting each other?
Right. 1 minute coffee is good for you, the next minute it's bad. It's enough to make your head spin. And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about. How do we cut through the noise and figure out what to trust?
We've got some really interesting sources lined up that point to a powerful tool for doing just that. It's called meta-analysis.
Meta-analysis. Okay. So before we dive in, can you give us a quick overview? What exactly is meta-analysis and why should our listeners care?
In a nutshell, meta-analysis is a way to systematically combine the results of multiple studies to get a more comprehensive and reliable picture of a particular topic. Think of it like this. Instead of relying on the findings of just one study, which might have its limitations or even be an outlier, you're looking at the big picture that emerges from lots of different studies.
So it's about looking at the forest, not just the trees.
Exactly. Our main source for this dive is a book called Doing Meta-Analysis in Our Hands-On Guide by Matthias Harrer, published in 2021. It's a really practical resource for understanding the how-tos of meta-analysis.
Great. So we've got our roadmap.
Yep.
Now let's talk about the problem that meta-analysis is trying to solve. You mentioned this feeling of information overload, just how much research is out there.
It's mind-boggling, really. Harrer shows this incredible graph of how many articles PubMed has been indexing over the years. In the mid-20th century, it was a few hundred a year, which seemed like a lot at the time. But now, in the 21st century, it's absolutely skyrocketed. It's like a hockey stick of scientific output.
Wow, that's a lot of data. You'd think that with so much research, we'd have everything figured out by now.
You would, wouldn't you? But there's a growing awareness that more research doesn't always translate into a better understanding or even a self-correcting scientific system. There's a great paper by John Ioannidis from 2012 titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False that really digs into this problem.
Why most published research findings are false? That's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but Ioannidis makes a compelling case. He points out various factors that can contribute to this, things like publication bias, where studies with positive results are more likely to get published, and small sample sizes, which can lead to unreliable findings.
Okay, so it's not just about the quantity of research, but also the quality and how it's reported.
Right. And there's this idea, mentioned by Paul Meehl way back in 1978, that some theories in the social sciences kind of fade away like fashion trends, not necessarily because they've been disproven, but because the excitement around them dies down.
So how does meta-analysis fit into all of this?
Meta-analysis offers a way to step back from this potentially chaotic landscape of individual studies and try to synthesize the evidence in a more rigorous and objective way. One of the pioneers in this field, Gene Glass, described it as an analysis of analyses. Instead of individual participants being the units of analysis, it's the studies themselves that are being analyzed.
I see. So if a study looks at how well a new medication works, a meta-analysis would gather data from many different studies on that medication, all looking at the same outcome, and then combine those results to get a more overall picture of how effective the medication really is.
Exactly. And the goal, as Lipsey and Wilson put it in their 2001 book on practical meta-analysis, is to combine, summarize, and interpret the available evidence on a specific research question.
That sounds like a really valuable approach, especially when you've got a lot of research out there that might be pointing in different directions.
It is. It's important to note that meta-analysis is different from other ways of summarizing research. You've probably come across traditional narrative reviews, where an expert in a field gives their take on the state of the literature. But these reviews can sometimes be subjective and don't always follow clear rules for how they select or weigh the evidence.
Yeah, those can be helpful for getting an overview, but you're kind of relying on the expert's judgment.
Exactly. Then you have systematic reviews, which are more rigorous and transparent. They follow predefined methods for searching for and selecting studies with the aim of minimizing bias and including all the relevant evidence. But even systematic reviews typically don't go as far as meta-analysis in terms of statistically combining the results.
So meta-analysis takes systematic review to the next level by actually quantifying the overall effect. What kind of things can meta-analyses quantify?
All sorts of things. For example, it can tell you the average effect size of a particular treatment, the prevalence of a disease in a certain population, the strength of a correlation between two variables, and so on. But it's important to remember that it can only be applied to studies that report their results in a quantitative way, meaning they use numbers. And to make the combined result meaningful, the studies often need to be reasonably similar in their design and the way they measured things.
Got it. So it's not just about throwing any and all studies into a statistical blender. There's a real art to selecting appropriate studies and making sure they're comparable.
Absolutely. You can't just combine apples and oranges and expect a meaningful fruit salad.
Speaking of combining things, where did this idea of meta-analysis even come from? It doesn't sound like something that's always been around.
You're right, it's a relatively recent development, at least in its modern form. But the roots of the idea go back further than you might think. In the early 20th century, statisticians were already starting to grapple with the challenge of summarizing data from multiple sources. For example, Carl Pearson, a prominent British statistician, did some early work on combining data from different studies on typhoid inoculation. And a few decades later, Ronald A. Fisher, another influential statistician, emphasized that research findings could vary depending on where and when a study was conducted, highlighting the need to look at evidence from multiple locations and time periods.
So the seeds were planted early on. What really launched meta-analysis into the mainstream?
There was a pivotal moment in the mid-20th century that really put meta-analysis on the map. In 1952, a psychologist named Hans-Jürgen Eysenck published a paper claiming that psychotherapy was ineffective. He looked at the available studies at the time and argued that people who underwent therapy improved at about the same rate as those who didn't receive any treatment.
That must have been a bombshell for the field of psychotherapy.
Oh, it absolutely was. It sparked a huge controversy and a lot of debate. Fast forward a couple of decades, and this is where Gene Glass comes in. He was a researcher who was really interested in developing more rigorous methods for synthesizing research findings. He came up with a way to statistically combine something called standardized mean differences from different studies. Basically, this allowed researchers to put results from studies that might have used different outcome measures onto a common scale, making them comparable.
So it's like translating different languages into a common one so you can understand what everyone is saying.
Perfect analogy. Glass applied this method to the very question that Eysenck had tackled: the effectiveness of psychotherapy. In a landmark study published in 1977 with his colleague Mary Lee Smith, Glass analyzed hundreds of psychotherapy studies involving thousands of patients.
And what did they find? Did their meta-analysis support Eysenck's claim that therapy was useless?
Not at all. Their analysis actually showed a significant positive effect of psychotherapy, suggesting that it was indeed helpful. This finding directly challenged Eysenck's earlier conclusion and really demonstrated the power of meta-analysis to provide a more comprehensive and reliable picture of the evidence.
I can imagine that Eysenck wasn't too thrilled about this newfangled mega silliness, as he called it.
You're telling me.
Oh.
He was quite dismissive of Glass's work. But the thing is, despite Eysenck's skepticism, numerous meta-analyses conducted since then have consistently shown that at least some forms of psychotherapy are effective for a variety of mental health conditions. This whole episode really solidified meta-analysis as a valuable and increasingly accepted research method.
It sounds like Glass was really the key figure in all of this.
He played a crucial role, no doubt, but it's important to remember that he wasn't working in isolation. Around the same time, other researchers were also developing meta-analytic techniques, often independently of each other. For example, Frank Schmidt and Jack Hunter, who were doing research in industrial organizational psychology, made significant contributions to the field, particularly in developing methods for correcting for measurement errors across studies.
So multiple people were converging on this idea from different angles. It sounds like the time was ripe for this kind of methodological innovation.
Exactly. And meta-analysis also started gaining traction in other fields, notably medicine. For instance, Peter Elwood and Archie Cochrane, who were pioneers in evidence-based medicine, used meta-analysis to demonstrate the preventive effects of aspirin on heart attacks, a finding that had a huge impact on clinical practice. And then there's the work of Rebecca Dersimonian and Nan Laird, who, in the mid-1980s, developed a statistical method for something called random effects meta-analyses, which is still widely used today.
It's fascinating to see how these different threads came together to make meta-analysis such a widely used tool across so many disciplines.
It really is. But with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Yeah.
So while meta-analysis offers incredibly valuable insights, it's not a silver bullet, and has its limitations, some of which have been pointed out even by people who strongly advocate for rigorous scientific research.
Yeah.
You might see multiple meta-analyses published on the same popular topic, and sometimes they reach different conclusions.
Right, that doesn't exactly inspire confidence.
I know. And it really underscores the point that meta-analysis isn't about blindly accepting the results as gospel truth. We always need to be critical and look at the details. Another issue is reproducibility. We've talked before about how important it is for scientists to be able to replicate each other's findings, but sometimes that's difficult with meta-analyses because the original studies being included might not have reported enough detail about their methods.
That makes sense. If you don't know exactly what was done in the original studies, it's hard to evaluate how reliable the meta-analytic results are.
Right. And then there's the fundamental issue that the quality of a meta-analysis is only as good as the quality of the studies that go into it. Garbage in, garbage out, as they say. If the original studies were poorly designed or have other major flaws, even the most sophisticated statistical techniques used in the meta-analysis can't magically fix those problems.
So a really well-conducted meta-analysis of a bunch of badly done studies might give you a precise-looking result, but that result itself might be totally meaningless.
Precisely. That's why organizations like the Cochrane Collaboration have played such an important role in promoting high standards for systematic reviews and meta-analyses. They were founded in the early 1990s, named after Archie Cochrane, a British physician who was a strong advocate for evidence-based medicine. They produce these really comprehensive resources like the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews of Interventions, which is kind of the Bible for how to do this kind of research properly.
So they're like the guardians of good meta-analytic practice, trying to make sure that these studies are done with rigor and transparency. What are some of the common pitfalls that researchers and people trying to understand research should watch out for when it comes to meta-analysis?
Well, there are several big ones that are worth highlighting. First up is what's often called the apples and oranges problem, which is also known as the issue of heterogeneity. Even when you have clear criteria for which studies to include in your meta-analysis, those studies will never be exactly the same. They might have used slightly different populations, interventions, outcome measures, you name it.
Right, like if you're doing a meta-analysis on the effects of exercise on depression, one study might have used aerobic exercise, another might have used yoga, and another might have used weightlifting.
Exactly. And if those differences are important for the question you're trying to answer, then combining the results of those studies into a single overall number might not make a lot of sense. It would be like trying to combine studies on the effects of fertilizer on tomato plants with studies on the effects of psychotherapy on anxiety. You could statistically calculate an average, but it wouldn't really tell you anything useful about either tomatoes or anxiety.
Okay, so heterogeneity is a real concern. But is some variation always a bad thing?
Not necessarily. Sometimes the variation between studies can actually be informative. For example, if you find that a particular intervention works well across a range of different settings and populations, that strengthens the evidence for its effectiveness. But you always need to carefully consider whether the differences between the studies are meaningful for the question you're trying to answer.
So it's not just about blindly combining everything. It's about thoughtfully considering whether the studies are actually comparable. What's another pitfall to be aware of?
A big one is the garbage in, garbage out problem. This one is pretty straightforward. If the individual studies that are included in the meta-analysis are poorly designed or have other significant flaws, then even the most sophisticated statistical wizardry in the world can't fix those underlying problems. As we said before, if you average a bunch of unreliable numbers, you're just going to get a more precise-looking unreliable number.
So a meta-analysis can't magically turn bad science into good science. It's all about the quality of the ingredients.
Exactly. And sometimes the most honest and valuable conclusion of a meta-analysis might be that there simply isn't enough high-quality evidence available to draw firm conclusions. This can be really important for guiding future research efforts.
Makes sense. What about other potential biases? Are there any that can sneak into meta-analyses?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is what's known as the file drawer problem, which is also called publication bias. This refers to the unfortunate fact that not all research studies see the light of day. There's a well-documented tendency for studies that find positive or statistically significant results to be more likely to get published than studies that find negative or null results.
I've definitely heard of that. It's like the studies that don't find anything interesting get shoved into a file drawer, never to be seen again.
Precisely. And this can really skew the results of a meta-analysis because you're only seeing a biased subset of the evidence. It's like trying to judge the average height of people by only looking at basketball players. You're going to get a misleadingly tall estimate.
So how do researchers try to account for this publication bias?
There are a few things they can do. One is to try to be as comprehensive as possible in their search for studies, including looking for unpublished research, such as conference presentations or dissertations. Another approach is to use statistical techniques to try to estimate the potential impact of publication bias. For example, if there's an overabundance of studies that just barely reach statistical significance, that might be a red flag that there are other non-significant studies that haven't been published.
It sounds like it's a bit of a detective game, trying to uncover the missing pieces of the puzzle.
It can be. And it highlights the importance of being cautious about interpreting meta-analytic findings, especially when those findings seem too good to be true. Always ask yourself, what might be missing from this picture?
Okay, so we've got the apples and oranges problem, the garbage in, garbage out problem, and the file drawer problem. Anything else we need to be aware of?
One more big one is what's sometimes called the researcher agenda problem, which is essentially about researcher bias. When researchers conduct a meta-analysis, they have to make a lot of decisions. Which studies to include, how to analyze the data, which statistical models to use, and so on. And even with the best of intentions, these decisions can be influenced, even subconsciously, by the researcher's own beliefs, expectations, or even vested interests in a particular outcome.
I can see how that could happen. If you really believe that a certain intervention is effective, you might be more likely to interpret the data in a way that supports that belief.
Exactly. There's even been research showing that if you give the same data set to different teams of researchers, they can sometimes come to different conclusions just because of the different choices they make in the analysis. This is why it's so important for researchers to be transparent about their methods and to try to minimize bias in their decision-making process.
It sounds like meta-analysis, while powerful, requires a healthy dose of caution and critical thinking. It's not just a matter of blindly accepting the results at face value.
You've got it. But even with these limitations, meta-analysis is a huge step forward from relying on individual studies or expert opinions. It provides a way to synthesize research evidence in a much more systematic and quantitative way. And when it's done well, it can be an incredibly valuable tool for understanding complex phenomena and making informed decisions.
So, to sum up, it's important to remember that science is a messy human endeavor. Not all research findings are created equal. Data can be analyzed in different ways, and those choices can influence the results. Meta-analysis offers a way to move beyond individual subjectivity towards a more collective understanding by looking at the big picture that emerges from multiple studies. But we always need to be mindful of the potential pitfalls, such as combining apples and oranges, relying on garbage data, missing unpublished studies, and being aware of potential researcher bias.
Absolutely. By understanding these limitations, you're much better equipped to critically evaluate the findings of meta-analyses and to appreciate their strengths and weaknesses.
This deep dive into meta-analysis has given us a lot to chew on. It's a powerful reminder that we need to be thoughtful and discerning consumers of research.
And it raises a really important question for all of us. Given the complexities and potential biases inherent in the research landscape, how can we best navigate the constant influx of new information? How can we make sure we're basing our decisions on most reliable evidence available? This is something I'd encourage everyone to think about, not just in relation to the scientific literature, but in all aspects of our lives.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Until then, happy researching.